Mason Barlow had exactly 5 seconds to decide if he was going to do at Nyx'Vali. The Kran'Tor's deep, guttural laugh echoed through the amphitheater as the towering, dragon-like alien leaned back, his massive wings folding lazily behind him. His glowing yellow eyes flickered with amusement as his sharp claws tapped rhythmically against the metal desk. "Come now, Barlow," Nyx'Vali rumbled, his voice thick with condescension. "Surely you're not serious?" Mason forced himself to smile, a slow, deliberate kind of smile that suggested he was either incredibly confident or about to make the worst decision of his academic career. Possibly both. "I don't joke about academic matters, Nyx," Mason said, folding his arms. Nyx'Vali let out a low snort, a puff of faintly glowing mist curling from his nostrils. "So you're telling us, in front of the entire class, that the most dangerous creature on your homeworld is not one of your so-called apex predators, but rather," he gestured dramatically, "a dog?" The entire lecture hall erupted into laughter. High-frequency chimes from the crystalline species in the back, the deep, vibrating hums of the Draxians, the flickering pulses of bioluminescence from the aquatic species reacting with sheer amusement. Even Professor Luminox, the ever-stoic being of sentient light, flickered with something that translated suspiciously close to disbelief. And that's what made it unsettling. When the laughter finally started to die down, Mason casually leaned forward, resting his elbows on the sleek, obsidian desk before him, his fingers interlaced, his expression calm, composed. "Tell me, Nyx," he said conversationally, "when was the last time you needed to hunt?" Nyx'Vali blinked. "What?" "Hunt," Mason repeated, "as in track something, stalk it, wear it down over hours, days, just to get a single meal." Nyx'Vali frowned. "My kind evolved beyond such primitive means long ago. We do not hunt, we dominate." "Right," Mason said, nodding as if that was exactly the answer he expected. "So tell me, when was the last time your species had to track something for weeks? Through blistering heat, through rugged terrain, through exhaustion?" Nyx'Vali narrowed his eyes, something unreadable flashing across his reptilian face. Mason tilted his head. "You see, here's the thing," he continued, voice smooth, measured. "Most species in this room evolved to be efficient. You go for the vital points. You knock down your target in seconds. But humans?" He smiled. "A slow, creeping thing. We don't need to be efficient." A low hum of unease rippled through the class. Mason's voice dropped. "We're not the fastest, not the strongest, not even the smartest, if we're being honest." He exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the desk. "But we don't stop." Nyx'Vali's tail twitched. "We're persistence hunters," Mason continued. "Do you know what that means?" No one spoke. Mason leaned in just a little further. "It means we run, we track, we chase things. Not because we're stronger, not because we're faster, but because we can look at a creature miles away and say, 'I will outlast you.'" Professor Luminox flickered uncomfortably. Mason's gaze swept across the room, his grin sharpening at the growing discomfort on his classmates' faces. "You think I'm joking?" he mused. "That's fine. But let me ask you something. How many creatures in your homeworld willingly go up against something bigger than them?" Mason exhaled, sitting back. "That's why I'm not choosing one of our apex predators," he said simply. "Because apex predators have limits. They eat until they're full. They hunt when they must. They act when they're angered." He let the weight of his words settle. "Humans," he smiles. "We hunt because we want to." Nyx'Vali's wings twitched. His tail flicked once, twice against the floor, a rhythmic thud-thud that betrayed a flicker of irritation. He had expected an easy victory, a chance to humiliate the lone human in the class. But now, Mason's words lingered in the air, thick and unsettling, like the scent of ozone before a storm. Professor Luminox, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his crystalline form dimming slightly in contemplation. "Mason Barlow?" And the professor's voice resonated in perfect harmony, carrying a weight of authority. "I assume, then, that you will be presenting on this persistence hunting in your final examination?" Mason's lips quirked. "Something like that," he said lightly, tapping a few commands into his datapad. "But I think it'll be more fun if I show you," Nyx'Vali said. "What could you possibly show us?" His voice was sharper now, more irritated. "Your world is primitive. Your people, he exhaled, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the absurdity of the conversation. You still rely on fire and sharpened metal? What could you possibly present that could compare to creatures that consume black holes for nourishment? Mason didn't answer immediately. He only smiled, and for some reason, that smile sent a ripple of unease through the room. Tell me, Nyx, he said conversationally, what happens when an apex predator gets tired? Nyx'Vali frowned as if the question was beneath him. It stops. Right, Mason nodded. It stops. It waits. It recovers. His eyes gleamed. And what happens when the thing chasing it doesn't stop? Mason leaned back in his chair, stretching out like he had all the time in the world. See? That's what you don't get. Your world is all about strength. Power. You've evolved to be the best at the moment of attack. He tilted his head, considering his next words. But humans? We've evolved for the long game. A flicker of something like doubt crossed Nyx'Vali's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He shakes his head. Fine, Barlow, he said, voice dripping with amusement. If your species is so terrifying, so relentless, then prove it. His wings spread slightly as he leaned forward. Show us something that will make us fear you. Mason didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply tapped a few more keys on his datapad. The overhead holoprojector flickered to life, filling the room with a crisp, high-definition image. A lone figure stood on an endless stretch of cracked, sun-baked earth, the heat radiating in visible waves. The image zoomed in, focusing on the figure's face. Sweat glistened on bronzed skin, eyes dark with unshakable focus. Mason's voice was calm, measured. This is a human. No weapons. No claws. No venom. Just 2 legs and lungs built for endurance. The camera panned out, revealing a massive beast just ahead of the man. It was a towering thing, thick-muscled and covered in dust, its powerful limbs trembling with exhaustion. Its sides heaved as it struggled to suck in air, foam gathering at its mouth. Mason tapped the screen, highlighting the man's steady breathing. Notice something? He asked, his voice casual. Nyx'Vali's eyes narrowed. He's not tired. Mason smiled. Exactly. The beast, some kind of horned mammal, larger than any predator in the classes. Collective memory, staggered forward another few steps before collapsing onto its knees, its body too overheated, too drained to keep going. The man didn't rush in for the kill. He simply waited, standing over his prey, watching as the inevitable settled in. A few seconds later, the beast tipped sideways onto the ground, panting, utterly spent. The man finally stepped forward. He simply placed his hand on the dying animal's side and ended the hunt. The hollow footage cut to black. No one spoke. Even Professor Luminox's crystalline form had dimmed to a dull, contemplative glow. Mason let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel it. Finally, he glanced at Nyx'Vali, whose tail was twitching in a way that suggested some very uncomfortable gears were turning in his head. You wanted proof? Mason murmured. You just got it. Nyx'Vali's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his wings folding tighter against his back. Mason leaned in, voice quiet but heavy. Your apex predators are strong, Nyx. But strength doesn't matter when you're too exhausted to use it. For the first time since Mason had arrived at the academy, Nyx'Vali had no smug retort. And for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. The silence in the lecture hall stretched, thick and heavy. Even the ever-glowing bioluminescent species had dimmed their lights. And the nanite swarms that made up some of Mason's classmates had frozen mid-shift, forming erratic, unreadable patterns. The weight of understanding settled on them like a slow-moving glacier. The truth had been laid bare, and now they had to reconcile it with everything they thought they knew. Nyx'Vali sat rigidly, his wings pulled in so tightly they nearly vanished against his back. His breathing had slowed, controlled, but Mason could see the tension in his jaw, the way his claws flexed ever so slightly against the metal of his desk. The Kran'Tor was thinking, processing, calculating whether what he had just witnessed was an anomaly or a danger. Professor Luminox flickered back to full brightness, their crystalline matrix humming with what could only be described as concerned academic interest. A fascinating example of persistence hunting, the professor finally said, their voice reverberating with controlled neutrality. It certainly demonstrates an unexpected biological advantage. However, the professor's glow shifted to something cooler, almost skeptical. This tactic? while impressive, does not necessarily qualify humans as the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Endurance alone does not make one an apex predator. Mason exhaled, slow and measured, like he had been waiting for that exact argument.
You're right,
Professor, he said easily. Endurance alone isn't enough. He tapped the datapad again. The projector flared back to life. The new footage was grainy, old historical footage from centuries ago. It showed a vast, frozen tundra, a sky heavy with storm clouds. At first, it was unclear what the video was supposed to show. The landscape was empty and desolate. Then, a dark figure emerged from the snow. It was humanoid, wrapped in thick furs, moving with a purposeful stride. Another appeared beside them, and another. The camera panned, revealing their target, a towering, prehistoric beast covered in shaggy fur. Its massive tusks curving. The creature was wounded, its breath heavy, visible in the freezing air. It swung its head, sensing the hunters. And yet, the humans did not rush in. They did not attack blindly. They surrounded it. Not with brute force, not with speed, with strategy. Mason's voice was soft, yet unshakable. This is what makes us dangerous. The footage accelerated, showing how the humans coordinated, one distracting, another maneuvering behind, another anticipating the beast's next movement. It tried to escape, but every path it took was a dead end. Every move was anticipated. The hunters worked together as if they had mapped out the battle before it even began. When the final blow came, it wasn't from rage or instinct or desperation. It was inevitable. Mason let the video end before speaking again. We don't fight like predators, he said, scanning the room. We fight like something worse. He leaned forward. We fight like engineers. The crystalline professor's glow flickered erratically as if they were struggling to process a new and unsettling equation. Nyx'Vali's tail lashed once against the floor. His voice was quieter this time. So you plan. You adapt. He narrowed his glowing yellow eyes. That still does not make you stronger. Mason smiled. Another tap on the datapad. A new image filled the air. This time, it wasn't ancient history. It was war. Flashes of fire. Smoke rises over crumbling cities. Vast battlefields stretch into the horizon. Armies clashing with precision that should not have been possible. Weapons that blurred the line between technology and sheer human ingenuity. The footage shifted an alien force, a species none of them recognized, advancing toward what should have been a helpless human settlement. Their ships were larger, and their weapons were more advanced. Logically, they should have won. But they didn't. Because humans didn't meet them with brute force. They met them with guerrilla tactics, with ambushes, with unpredictability. They exploited weaknesses, adapted in real time, and turned the enemy's own strengths against them. Mason turned to Nyx'Vali, his expression unreadable. We don't need to be stronger. He let that hang in the air for a beat before finishing. We just need to make you weaker. The room felt colder. Nyx'Vali's claws clenched into fists. He stopped, opened his mouth, closed it again. He took a sharp breath through his nose, forcing his composure back into place. That still does not make you apex predators. You are merely resourceful. His voice wavered on the last word as if even he wasn't convinced. Mason cocked his head, studying him. All right, he said simply. Then let me ask you one thing. He gestured vaguely to the room. All of you, every species here, what's the most dangerous creature on your homeworld? A moment of hesitation. Then the answers came. The void serpent of Karth Os-Sev, one student offered. It consumes entire moons in its feeding cycle. The ash strider, another said. It stalks the volcanic wastelands and can phase between dimensions. The swarm mothers, a third added. Each one commands a hive of billions, and they can strip an entire planet in days. Mason listened patiently, nodding, letting them finish. Then, with deliberate slowness, he asked, And how many of you have ever successfully hunted one? Mason smiled. That's the difference, he said. Your apex predators are strong. Yes, they're terrifying. But they don't change. They don't adapt. They exist in their ecosystem exactly as they always have. Humans? We don't just hunt our apex predators. His voice was quiet now, but razor sharp. We tame them. Professor Luminox dimmed again, visibly disturbed. Nyx'Vali exhaled slowly, something flickering behind his eyes, an emotion Mason couldn't quite place. Recognition, perhaps. or the first whisper of fear. Mason sat back, folding his arms behind his head, stretching lazily like the conversation had been nothing more than an idle chat over breakfast. "All right," he said. "Who's next?" No one volunteered. The silence stretched so long that it almost became a living thing, a weight pressing down on the room. No one volunteered to present next. Professor Luminox flickered uncertainly, their normally controlled crystalline glow now pulsing in uneven waves. The lecture hall, once a lively place filled with chatter, felt eerily still. Mason watched them, waiting, letting the discomfort linger. He could feel it now, that shift, that invisible line, once so clear, is now blurred beyond recognition. Before today, he had been a novelty, a curiosity, a weak but amusing anomaly among giants. Finally, Nyx'Vali broke the silence, but his voice was different now, lower, measured. "You claim," he said slowly, "that your people hunt not just for survival, but for conquest. That you tame what should never be tamed. That you turn nature's creations into tools, into weapons." His golden eyes locked onto Mason's with something that might have been admiration if it weren't so heavily laced with wariness. "But all of that, your endurance, your strategy, your cunning, it is still driven by necessity. A true apex predator does not need to conquer." He straightened, regaining some of his composure, his wings spreading slightly. "They simply are." Mason exhaled softly, tilting his head. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "Because that's the difference between us and everything else in this galaxy." His fingers danced over his datapad one last time. The projection flared back to life, but this time, there was no battlefield, no ancient hunt, no starving beast succumbing to exhaustion. This time, it was Earth, a spinning blue-green marble, hanging against the black void of space. Mason let the image sit there for a moment before he spoke. "You think we fight because we have to," he said, scanning the room. "That our nature, our need to adapt, to dominate, to control, is something we developed purely for survival." He let his gaze settle on Nyx'Vali. "But that's the mistake every species makes when they try to understand us." He tapped the screen, zooming in. The projection shifted, showing cities, vast, sprawling metropolises glittering with light, stretching across continents, built atop landscapes that once belonged to nature's fiercest hunters. Then it shifted again, showing space stations hanging in orbit like mechanical moons, then terraforming projects on barren worlds, then colonies on planets that had never known human footsteps. "We don't just hunt to survive," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We hunt because it's in our nature." The projection shifted again. This time, it wasn't just Earth. It was Mars, Europa, Titan, Kepler 442b, Proxima Centauri b. Planets not of Earth. Planets that should have been empty, unlivable. But they weren't. They had lights, cities, structures, signs of human life. A slow, dawning realization spread across the room. It was one thing to see humans conquer their own world, to tame their own apex predators. It was another thing entirely to realize that they had already started taming the stars. Nyx'Vali's wings tensed. His tail lashed once, betraying the smallest flicker of unease. Professor Luminox pulsed a shade darker. "This," the professor hesitated, recalibrating their thoughts. "This expansion, this level of planetary control, how long has it been occurring?" Mason turned to face him fully, and for the first time, he wasn't smiling. "Less than 200 years. The professor dimmed further. Nyx'Vali's claws curled against the desk. "You mean to say," he began, his voice strained, "that in only 2 centuries, your people have already begun spreading across multiple planets?" Mason gave a small, slow nod. "And we're just getting started." The weight of that statement crashed down on the room like a tidal wave. Because no species, no empire, no civilization in recorded galactic history had expanded at that speed. Not without thousands, sometimes millions of years to perfect their technology, to reach beyond their own stars. And yet, here sat Mason Barlow, a single representative of a species that hadn't waited. That never stopped. They treated even the infinite black void of space the same way they treated every other frontier, as something to be conquered. Nyx'Vali inhaled sharply, and for the first time since Mason had met him, his voice lacked even a trace of arrogance. "How far do you intend to go?" Mason turned back to the projection. Earth was still there, still spinning. But the image now included a ship. A sleek, terrifyingly advanced human spacecraft, breaking orbit. A ship designed for deep space travel, its trajectory aimed not at their neighboring planets, but beyond, as far as human ambition could take them. Mason let the image speak for itself before finally answering, his voice steady. As far as the universe lets us. Nyx'Vali sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His wings shifted, his claws relaxed, but his expression had changed. Mason recognized it instantly. It wasn't the look of someone who had lost an argument. It was the look of someone who had just realized the inevitable, that his people would not be the ones ruling the future, because the future had already been claimed. The weight of realization settled over the room, pressing down on every student, every professor, and every being that had once looked at Mason Barlow with amusement or mild curiosity. That amusement was gone now. What remained was something heavier, something more uncertain, more primal. Professor Luminox dimmed their glow to a near-muted flicker, their crystalline form unusually still. Nyx'Vali, the ever-proud Kran'Tor warrior, was silent. His tail no longer twitched. His wings had folded so close to his body that they looked almost defensive. His golden eyes, once sharp with a challenge, held something else entirely. Mason saw it. He recognized it. A deep, uneasy understanding that humans were not to be dismissed. Nyx'Vali inhaled slowly, his voice quieter than it had been all day. So you do not just survive. His jaw clenched, his claws flexing against the desk's surface. You spread. Mason met his gaze evenly. That's what we do. Nyx'Vali exhaled. A slow, measured release as if he were recalibrating his entire worldview. The Kran'Tor had built their empire on dominance. They had spent millennia at the top, unchallenged, unquestioned. To them, the strong ruled by sheer force. The weak fell away. But humans didn't stop. They didn't just fight. They conquered. Not through strength alone, but through time, through patience, through sheer, relentless willpower. The realization was a quiet, creeping thing, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Mason could see it sinking in. Not just in Nyx'Vali, in everyone. Even Professor Luminox, the oldest mind in the room, looked troubled. Their glow flickered erratically, their voice carrying the weight of a scholar who had spent centuries studying the patterns of the galaxy, only to find a new, unforeseen variable disrupting everything. The implications of this. Luminox hesitated as if carefully choosing their words. If your species continues at this rate of expansion, we will. Mason's interruption was soft but absolute. Luminox pulsed a shade dimmer. Then it is not a question of if humanity will become a dominant force in the galaxy. Their voice hummed with something just shy of disbelief. It is a question of when. The facts were laid bare. The galaxy was already changing. Nyx'Vali exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his jaw in contemplation. And what? He muttered, his voice heavy with something Mason could only describe as dread. Do you intend to do with it? Mason paused. Then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. Not the cocky grin they had come to expect from him. Not the teasing smirk of a human playing the fool. But something real. Something genuine. That's the funny thing, Mason said, his voice thoughtful. You all assume we have a plan. He tapped his fingers lightly against the desk, glancing back up at the holographic image of Earth, surrounded now by its growing reach into the stars. The truth? He let the silence hang for a beat, then shrugged. We don't. Nyx'Vali's head snapped up. What? Mason grinned, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You think there's some grand design? His gaze swept across the room. Some master plan for galactic domination? He laughed, shaking his head. We're not like you, Nyx. We don't have an end goal. His smile widened, something dangerous flickering beneath it. We just keep going. A shudder passed through the room. Luminox pulsed uncertainly. Then what is your limit? Mason's expression didn't change. We haven't found one yet. Nyx'Vali sat there, motionless, staring at him as if seeing humanity for the very first time. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded. The Kran'Tor warrior exhaled once, deep and slow. Then he stood, stretching out his wings with deliberate ease. I would challenge you, Barlow, he murmured, his voice quieter than usual, but I suspect it would not end the way I want. Mason tilted his head. Are you admitting you can't win? Nyx'Vali gave him a look, sharp, assessing, yet edged with something resembling respect. No. His wings flicked once. I am admitting that I no longer know what winning looks like. Luminox hummed thoughtfully. Perhaps that is the true strength of humanity. Their glow brightened, their voice resonating with quiet realization. Not their endurance, not their intelligence, but their unpredictability. Mason chuckled, leaning back. Now you're getting it. The weight in the room shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed, transformed into something else. The weight of realization settled over the room, pressing down on every student, every professor, and every being that had once looked at Mason Barlow with amusement or mild curiosity. That amusement was gone now. What remained was something heavier, something more uncertain. Professor Luminox dimmed their glow to a near-muted flicker, their crystalline form unusually still. Nyx'Vali, the ever-proud Kran'Tor warrior, was silent. His tail no longer twitched. His wings had folded so close to his body that they looked almost defensive. His golden eyes, once sharp with a challenge, held something else entirely. A deep, uneasy understanding that humans were not to be dismissed. Nyx'Vali inhaled slowly, his voice quieter than it had been all day. So you do not just survive. His jaw clenched, his claws flexing against the desk's surface. You spread. Mason met his gaze evenly. That's what we do. Nyx'Vali exhaled, a slow, measured release as if he were recalibrating his entire worldview. The Kran'Tor had built their empire on dominance. They had spent millennia at the top, unchallenged, unquestioned. To them, the strong ruled by sheer force. The weak fell away. But humans didn't stop. They didn't just fight. They conquered, not through strength alone, but through time, through patience, through sheer, relentless willpower. The realization was a quiet, creeping thing, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Mason could see it sinking in, not just in Nyx'Vali, but in everyone. Even Professor Luminox, the oldest mind in the room, looked troubled. Their glow flickered erratically, their voice carrying the weight of a scholar who had spent centuries studying the patterns of the galaxy, only to find a new, unforeseen variable disrupting everything. The implications of this. Luminox hesitated as if carefully choosing their words. If your species continues at this rate of expansion, we will. Mason's interruption was soft but absolute. Luminox pulsed a shade dimmer. Then it is not a question of if humanity will become a dominant force in the galaxy. Their voice hummed with something just shy of disbelief. It is a question of when. Nyx'Vali exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his jaw in contemplation. And what? He muttered, his voice heavy with something Mason could only describe as dread. Do you intend to do with it? Mason paused. Then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. Not the cocky grin they had come to expect from him, but something real, something genuine. That's the funny thing, Mason said, his voice thoughtful. You all assume we have a plan. He tapped his fingers lightly against the desk, glancing back up at the holographic image of Earth, surrounded now by its growing reach into the stars. The truth? He let the silence hang for a beat, then shrugged. We don't. Nyx'Vali's head snapped up. What? Mason grinned, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You think there's some grand design? His gaze swept across the room. Some master plan for galactic domination? He laughed, shaking his head. We're not like you, Nyx. We don't have an end goal. His smile widened, something dangerous flickering beneath it. We just keep going. A shudder passed through the room. Luminox pulsed uncertainly. Then what is your limit? Mason's expression didn't change. We haven't found one yet. Nyx'Vali sat there, motionless, staring at him as if seeing humanity for the very first time. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded. Not in defeat, not in submission, but in understanding. The Kran'Tor warrior exhaled once, deep and slow. Then he stood, stretching out his wings with deliberate ease. I would challenge you, Barlow, he murmured, his voice quieter than usual, but I suspect it would not end the way I want. Mason tilted his head. Are you admitting you can't win? Nyx'Vali gave him a look, sharp, assessing, yet edged with something resembling respect. No. His wings flicked once. I am admitting that I no longer know what winning looks like. Luminox hummed thoughtfully. Perhaps that is the true strength of humanity. Their glow brightened, their voice resonating with quiet realization. Not their endurance, not their intelligence, but their unpredictability. Mason chuckled, leaning back. Now you're getting it. The weight in the room shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed, transformed into something else. That is recognition. Mason stretched lazily, gathering his data pad, standing as if nothing monumental had just happened. As if he hadn't just rewritten the way half the species in this room would look at humanity forever. "Well," he said casually, slinging his bag over his shoulder, "that was fun." Nyx'Vali huffed. "You are insufferable." Mason grinned. "And yet, you'll be thinking about this conversation for years." Nyx'Vali's tail flicked. He didn't deny it. Mason turned, heading toward the exit. He had things to do, people to call, homework to pretend he cared about. Before he left, though, he glanced over his shoulder, meeting Nyx'Vali's gaze one last time. "You asked what we intend to do with our expansion," Mason said, his voice softer now. "Honestly?" He shrugged. "We don't know." Nyx'Vali narrowed his eyes. "But here's my advice," Mason continued. His grin faded slightly, his expression turning unreadable. "When the time comes when we figure it out." His next words sent a final, lingering chill through the room. "You better hope you're on our side." And with that, Mason Barlow walked away, leaving behind a room full of the brightest minds in the galaxy. Leaders, warriors, scholars who now knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt. The future did not belong to them. It belonged to humans,